Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to BadZure, a tool designed for security practitioners to explore and understand attack paths within Azure Active Directory, or now called Entra ID environments. In this session, I want to start with an introduction where I want to talk a little bit about the current threat landscape in the cloud world, the new challenges in cybersecurity, and then how the idea of BadZure came to be. And then on the next section, I go dive into BadZure, how it works, the goals, the features, and a demo. So let's go ahead. A quick introduction. My name is Mauricio Velasco. I'm originally from Arequipa in Peru. That's a picture of my home city there. I'm currently a security researcher at Microsoft, no more than a month ago. And before that, I was in the Splunk threat research team also as a researcher. My Twitter account is M Velasco, and if you're still out there, and in my GitHub, I share the work I've done in detection engineering and adversary simulation and threat hunting. So if you're interested in these topics, check out my GitHub where you'll find tools, talks, workshops. Before we dive in, a quick disclaimer. Today I'm hosting this session and releasing this tool on my personal capacity. I'm not representing my employer in any way. All right. So I am with the global shift from on-premise environments to cloud environments. I think there's new trends and new challenges in the cybersecurity space, of course. And I think one significant challenge is the rising threat of identity attacks. And in the day of on-premises environments, of course, this attack is not a new attack, right? It's been around, but in the day of on-premises environments, we relied on perimeter defenses to help us protect against the abuse of these stolen accounts or stolen identities. So if an account was compromised or when an account was compromised, um, attackers had to be in your environment to be able to abuse these identities and consume services and search and steal information. However, on the cloud world, where ubiquitous access is required, cloud services can be consumed from anywhere. And those traditional boundaries have disappeared and have exposed these new ways of abusing those identities. So a single compromised account can now become a full-scale breach, and attackers are continuously developing new methods and techniques to compromise accounts and bypass protections to ultimately steal information and cause harm. And just to illustrate some of these attacks in the wild, let's go over a couple of news articles. BEC attacks, business email compromise attacks, they've been around as well. They're not new. However, if you look at them, they're really identity attacks where attackers are going after particular identities and accessing specific things like email or file to understand how an organization operates, how finance operates, and then execute a scam. It is an identity attack and unfortunately a pretty successful one. Um, when the MGN breach happened, it all started with one identity being compromised, a super user, unfortunately. And through a cloud identity provider, this identity was abused to finally deploy malware and disrupt the operations of this large organization and cause hundreds of millions of dollars of loss. And finally, also, not too long ago, Chinese hackers were able to forge authentication tokens, effectively spoofing identities and consuming Microsoft 365 services to read emails from government officials. But once again, identities being spoofed um, and abused. Now, of course, I think it's important that we as security practitioners, as blue teamers, as red teamers, as security researchers, we need to learn about how these new attacks are being executed and how identities can be abused. And of course, that comes with a learning list of protocols, technologies, but also vendors, right? And vendors who are providing these services of cloud native identity services that are used by organizations and then abused by attackers, we need to learn how these operate. And one of them, and the focus of this um, session today, is Azure Active Directory, or now Entra ID, which is Microsoft cloud-based identity and access management service, and is the backbone of Azure services. And also, as I think it's a natural migration path for traditional Active Directory organizations who used to manage identity and access management in using Active Directory, they all eventually migrate to this cloud service, and it's becoming more important, I guess, what I'm saying. And yeah, we need to learn more about how these attacks operate. And there are challenges, and just like learning any new thing, there are challenges, and that I went through myself at my previous organization at Splunk. I was tasked with writing detections for Azure AD attacks. And of course, the learning curve is always there. One important one is the theoretical knowledge versus practical experience. I think it's one thing to read about an attack and then to execute it yourself and look at the logs. And that requires test environments. And sometimes the configurations of these test environments, if you do it manually, it can be complex, it can be tedious. So that's when I identified the need for an automation tool to help us set up environments with and populate environments with users and configurations, and perhaps ways of allowing me to explore these attacks and these technologies. So that's how BadZure was born. And it was initially released last year. And the final version I prepared for a workshop I held. But let's talk about BadZure. So BadZure automates Azure AD tenant setup by creating users, groups, applications, service principals, so a bunch of identities. And then it randomly assigns groups and permissions to these principals to try to mimic an environment, right? But also the key difference, the key feature is that it allows users to create attack paths within these environments. That allows us to explore privilege escalation techniques. So it simulates initial access by employing common account takeover techniques, mimicking real-world scenarios. There's two in particular that we'll talk about. And also simulates privilege escalation by creating misconfigurations and allowing users to leverage the compromised accounts and gain higher access in Azure AD. So it's a tool that builds an environment for you to explore in different ways how these misconfigurations can be abused. And the way you can configure these tenants is by a flexible configuration YAML file, which we'll talk about the details on the demo. So we're not going to cover those details, but that's the structure of the YAML file. So let's talk about initial access. So for initial access, what BadZure does is once it creates these attack paths, they all have an initial access, which is an identity, a user. And BadZure provides two ways for you to use these identities or simulate attacks with these identities. Either getting a password back or getting a token back. So the first scenario is perhaps when there has been, some kind of phishing attack or credential stuffing attacks where attackers have obtained a password, and we can simulate that in a scenario. And the second one is perhaps when an attacker has executed a more advanced attack like token theft, but using malware to steal a token from an Azure, from memory, or perhaps adversary in the middle attack. So we can simulate a scenario where a user has been compromised in two ways, and we can explore these attack paths in two ways to see if there's any differences. And for privilege escalation, BadZure uses the service principal abuse technique. And this is not a new technique. It has been written about and video and talks have been created about it. But if you're new to this technique, essentially at a high level, think here's how it works. So the requirements for this technique is that we have an application registration in the environment that has some kind of privileged access. And then we have a user in the same tenant who perhaps is not privileged in the sense of having an Entra group that allows them to do something specific, but it does have the privileges to modify this particular app registration that has privileged access. So in the attacker scenario, what the compromised what the compromised account can be used by attackers for is to add credentials to this privileged application, and then we can authenticate as the service principal of this application registration and effectively escalate our privileges. That's at a high level, right? It's not my intention to describe this attack in detail. There's a lot of documentation out there, so you should go ahead and read more about this. In fact, this blog post is probably one of the best ones to describe this technique by Andy Robbins at SpecterOps. And I took the liberty of using one of his graphs, which is a really good way of explaining it. So think about a tenant where an application registration exists, and this application registration runs as a service principal, right? In terms of authentication. And this service principal has been granted this privilege role. But if you have a user here who has privileged application privileges over this application, this user can abuse the application by adding credentials to it and then authenticating as a service principal who has this high level information. That's kind of the attack path at a high level. And there are two ways essentially of the two types of permissions that can be abused. And I also recommend reading this blog post or this project by Fabian Bader. Um, um, his project is called User Attack Path. So he describes the two ways of privilege escalation. One with API permissions, particularly graph API permissions, where applications that have been assigned these permissions can be abused, or Entra roles, where instead of a graph API permission, we use an Entra role, in this case, for example, a privileged role administrator. Those are the two ways of service principal abuse in terms of permissions. And BadZure is able to randomly create these attack paths, supporting both, but since BadZure uses Terraform, it's able to randomly generate these assignments that are able to create these attack paths. So using 2 or 3 assignments, we can simulate these attack paths. Okay, so we're ready for the demo then. Okay, so I have here BadZure, and here's going to be my configuration file. I'm going to create the 30 users. You get the idea. Let's go over the details of the parameters, okay? So in order to create attack paths, first enable true or false. Here's initial access. You have 2 options, password or token. So BadZure is able to provide either a password or a token for the initial access. On the second parameter scenario, I'm not too happy about the name of this parameter, but let me explain what it does. When you have direct, it's going to, BadZure will randomly pick an application registration and then assign it high-level permissions, either using Azure AD roles or Graph API permissions, right? And then it's going to randomly find a user and assign it the ownership of this application. So if you use the direct type within the scenario, the password or token provider will be of the owner of that application, that user. But if you use help desk on the scenario, what BadZure does is picks another random user, assigns him or her the help desk administrator Entra role, so that this user becomes the new initial access. So this user is able to change the password of another user who is the owner of the application. So it adds an extra step to our attack path. The only privilege escalation technique supported now is service principal abuse, and this is our 2 methods, right? And if you put random here, BadZure is going to pick one of the uh, permissions that is possibly abusable. There's a handful. But you can also pick the exact one that you want to use. In this case, I had created attack path 3. This is the attack path that we're going to abuse to escalate privileges on this demo. All right, so with that, I'm just going to ask BadZure to build this environment. And if we can see here what BadZure is doing, create these files that are used by Terraform to create these resources on Azure AD. And you can see here the attack paths, which are essentially assignments. So I'll pause the video so we don't wait. And so once it finishes, it's going to provide a few details, right? So for each attack path, it provides the initial access user and the method that you pick. For example, for this one was password, so we get the password. But for this attack method, the initial access method was tokens. So we look at tokens, BadZure provided the tokens for this user. And finally, for the final attack path, we see. So this is the attack path that we're going to go after in this demo. And quickly showing here how the application registrations and users and groups, well, were created on the tenant. So now we'll simulate how this attack path can be abused by an attacker. And we're going to use PowerShell and the Graph API to do most of it. So the first step is to get a token by authenticating as the user who was in Nest, right? And with this password. And that's the attack path here. So we authenticate and get a token. And we are authenticated. So the attacker is likely going to start enumerating the environment. And listing users, listing groups, listing permissions. In this case, we list up all the applications and we see the application registrations that exist in the environment. And we can also start enumerating permissions. So in this case, I will enumerate which applications is this user the owner of. So if I copy my code right, and once again, using the Graph API to list that this user is owner of this one application, and if we look for it, the application will likely have the permissions that we assign in the BadZure configuration, if the demo worked. Let's check it out. So if we go to the API permissions, we see that yes, there's a graph permission, and that's the same one that we picked on our configuration file, which is this one. So, okay, since this user is the owner of this application, the user will be able to add a secret to it, a credential to this application registration. So we can do that, and that's a new secret that has been added by using this graph endpoint. And with that, we can authenticate as that service principal using this. And now we have a token of the service principal. And then our next step is we are going to, once again, list programmatically the API permissions that this service principal has, and that the only one is the one that we have assigned. So in this attack path, the attacker abusing this high-level Graph API permission, the idea is to grant the service principal a new API permission. And this API permission will allow us to use the graph to read emails from this tenant and read the emails from this user here. So let's do that. We're going to use that token and to assign ourselves a new privilege. And this privilege is the mail read privilege, described here. And if we look at the application registration, if we refresh it, we should see that now we have it. So in this attack path, then now we would have to get a fresh token to be able to abuse the newly granted API permission. So we get a token. And finally, we once again use the graph to read email from this mailbox, and we can see these are the emails that are on this mailbox, user's mailbox. So we have simulated how this attack path would have ended up in the loss of emails. So let's go back to the slides. All right, so what's next? Well, I think for future versions of BadZure, I want to introduce the use of more different or other Azure resources, different Azure resources like key vaults, virtual machines, to create different attack paths with different um, resources. Then I also want to introduce conditional access policies to be able to create conditional access on policies on demand and potentially create groups of users that require MFA, that don't require MFA, to also create new attack paths using that. I want to add a new initial access supported method, the idea of the compromise service principal. So we'll get an ID and the password of that secret of that service principal. And of course, new attack paths. Yeah, that's BadZure, guys. I hope you like it. Go ahead and visit the GitHub, download it, try it. Let me know if you have any ideas and give it a star. And finally, I don't want to close this session without, if you are a blue teamer and if it's your job to defend Azure AD or an Entra ID environment, uh, there are many interesting and free resources out there related to the detection analytics. So if you have a SIEM environment and you're looking to detect attacks against an Azure AD environment, you can look at the Splunk, at this research site at Splunk. The Splunk threat research team has developed many detections for Azure AD. Elastic has a few detections as well on their site. Sentinel, of course, has hunting queries and KQL and also a few detections, and Sigma. So check those out if you're looking to defend your environment. Um, okay, well, that's it for me. Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoy this session. Have a great day.